everybody. This is going to be 10.2 for Chapter 10, and we're going to start with the primary source from Andrew Jackson, who's going to be the focal point of this entire section, who said, "I was born for a storm, and a calm does not suit me," and oftentimes he was the storm, quite honestly. So let's look at the age of Jackson. If you get an age named after you, know you're pretty important. So Andrew Jackson was a contradictory figure. He was a man of democracy, small d democracy. He believed that all white male Americans should have the right to vote. He expanded the right to vote to many poor white citizens, however, still excluded many people. He was a self made rich man, but hated banks, and the uber wealthy of America were not on his side. And he was an advocate in general for states' rights, but also was one of the most powerful presidents we've ever had, if not the most powerful. He created the idea of the imperial president, where the president has more power than Congress or the judiciary, which kind of goes against the Constitution a little bit in the equal powers of the groups. So here's our seventh president, Andrew Jackson, president from 1829 to 37. He was born in the Carolinas, I believe South Carolina, but lived a lot of his life in Tennessee, where he was a general in the War of 1812, a congressman from Tennessee, the military governor of Florida, and later a senator from Tennessee. He was also the first president to survive an assassination attempt. A guy who believed he was King Richard III jumped out and tried to shoot Andrew Jackson twice, but both of his guns misfired, and Jackson decided to beat the guy nearly to death with his cane. So, political parties during this time had morphed into more than just like who you vote for. It was a form of popular entertainment. You would go, you'd watch a guy give a speech, you'd have some barbecue, you'd drink a beer, and you would, have listen to some music, have a good day outside, basically. And so this was kind of the new party system that we're seeing. We are also seeing the rise of sort of commercializing your presidential candidates, which is, of course, something that is normalized today, but back then it was sort of weird that a presidential candidate would almost try to sell himself, like Andrew Jackson did. So Jackson used things like he used these big parties where he would invite a lot of people, get them a little boozed up, listen to why you should vote for Andrew Jackson. He had nicknames like Old Hickory, and he also had a song written about him that was used as his presidential song, which of course, again, is all of these are sort of regular today, but back then they were noteworthy. So, for instance, here is the theme song of the Jackson campaign, The Hunters of Kentucky, which portrayed him as half horse and half alligator, strong and fast and snappy, and it told about his victories during the War of 1812. And they used this to compare Andrew Jackson to Henry Clay, who was not apparently half horse and half alligator. Now, along with this party atmosphere came the practical side of joining a political party, which is that if you played your cards right and if your political party won, that meant that you could get a real cushy job in the new administration. And this was called at the time rotation in office. However, it's better known as the spoils system, the idea of to the victor go the spoils. So if your political party wins, they will kick out all the other people in positions of power within the federal government and replace them with loyal members of the victorious party. And this is what happened when Jackson became president. He removed a lot of workers from departments within the U.S. government and replaced them with loyal Democrats, sometimes to the point where it was not that they were good at their jobs, but more that they had sort of paid their dues and therefore got the new cushy jobs. So here is a political cartoon written in 1877 that has Andrew Jackson sitting on top of a pig on a monument to the victors belong the spoils. And the pig is eating out of things labeled bribery, fraud, and spoils. So obviously this is somebody who did not look back on Andrew Jackson with positivity. Now, let's compare and contrast Whigs and Democrats a little bit. So the main issue that divided the two political parties at this time, and we'll see it in a variety of ways, is the role and the size of the federal government and what the power of the government should be. And this could be seen in the banks that we're going to talk about, the tariffs we're going to talk about, the internal improvements we're going to talk about, in general, Democrats were against most of these things. They were for the working class farmers and the artisans. They didn't like the wealthy bankers, the merchants, the traders. They also had young entrepreneurs on their side who felt that they had a better shot of getting wealthy if the government would stop favoring the wealthy merchants and bankers in the big cities. Whigs, however, focused on the American system that we talked about in earlier on in Chapter 10, with the protective tariffs, the national banks, the internal improvements. All three of these things are things that Jackson and the Democrats were not fans of. Whigs mostly found their support in the wealthy, or people who made their money off of the internal improvements like canals and rivers. However, slavery was a dividing factor between both the Democrats and the Whigs. Most slaveholders were voting Democrat, and it was sort of geographical, believing that Democrats were the defenders of states' rights, including the right in the southern states to own enslaved people. Meanwhile, there were some richer plantation owners who followed the Whigs. Now, although in general, let's look at one of the first big issues of the Jackson presidency, which is the nullification crisis. Jackson was in general in favor of states' rights over federal power. He believed that the states should have more power than the federal government in many cases. However, he didn't like it when this was sort of used against him. So Jackson spent a lot of his first term battling with South Carolina. So this is over a tariff that came out in 1828, right before Andrew Jackson became president. Now, Jackson's not a huge fan of this tariff. He's not a fan of any tariffs. But he really doesn't like it when people disagree with him. Now, this tariff raised prices on foreign goods. It hurt the South financially because the South was not able to export as much out of the country. Meanwhile, northern states and northern merchants were not as hurt as heavily by this tariff. Southern states especially hated this new tariff, this tax on foreign goods, calling it the tariff of abominations, basically the tariff of not nice things. And they were led by South Carolina. So here is a leaflet that came out in 1828, where we can see that this is a pro-Whig leaflet, where the tariff is seen as something good. Now, the government of South Carolina said that the tariff raised prices only on southern things, and therefore only benefited the North. They also said that the state governments had the power, and this is what really riled up Jackson, is that state governments had the power to ignore and not put into practice these laws that the federal government passed. Basically, they're saying that the state government has more power than the federal government. They had the power to nullify them. And this was not just about the tariff. This was a larger question of, can the states in general overrule laws passed by the federal government that they disagree with? And straight in their eye line with this was the issue of slavery. What if the federal government decides to get rid of slavery next, and we let them get rid of this tariff? So, one of the early defenders of nationalism, a guy named John C. Calhoun, he'd been part of the early American system in the Warhawks, had flipped and had become very devoted to sectionalism by 1828. He was very much on the side of the power of the states, especially his home state, South Carolina. Calhoun argued that South Carolina and any other states had the power to ignore federal laws that they disagreed with. He also argued this constitutionally in a piece that he wrote called Exposition and Protest. This made him enemy number one to Andrew Jackson, which is interesting because John C. Calhoun was Andrew Jackson's vice president during all this. So here's John C. Calhoun. He is alive from 1782 to 1850. From South Carolina, where he was a congressman, a senator. He later became Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and Vice President under both John Quincy Adams, who was a Whig, and Andrew Jackson, who was a Democrat. So he actually was Vice President under both guys from two different parties. Now, although others disagreed with Calhoun, Andrew Jackson was one of them. Jackson thought that the states did not have the power to overrule a federal law. And he especially thought that the states did not have the power to overrule him. He felt that this was a threat to his own power, and that he had the power to dictate what was constitutional. In the end, in Congress, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, a very powerful Whig, actually argued for a long time that the people had founded this country, not the states, and therefore the people had their representation in the federal government, not in the Congress and not in the state governments. And so he said that in the end, the federal government had the power to overrule or to pass these laws, not the states. So here's Daniel Webster, by the way, another important Whig, 1782 to 1852, from New Hampshire, though he lived mainly in Massachusetts, where he was a congressman and a senator and secretary of state twice and under two different presidents. And he was thought to be such a good lawyer that in a piece of fiction printed in the 1930s, they actually got Daniel Webster to defend a guy who sold his soul to the devil in a short story called The Devil and Daniel Webster. So, this all brought about what was called the nullification crisis. Does the president have the power to pass a law even if the states don't like it? Can the states overrule a federal law? And this is called the nullification crisis. And it opened the door to larger issues. Calhoun especially said that he wasn't interested in things like succession or secession, but Jackson worried that this could be the start of disunion, even possibly civil war. And so in 1832, after they finally passed this tariff, South Carolina said that they would not abide by it and nullified it. In response to this, Andrew Jackson pushed through the Force Act, which authorized him to use the Army and Navy to collect taxes from the states. So basically, he was going to march his army into South Carolina to force them to give up the tariff money. This could start a war right here. And also, no way this is going to, be a problem again in about 30 years. In desperation, trying to stop what could become a civil war, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who disagreed on most things but agreed on keeping the Union together, passed a compromise tariff in 1833, which reduced the taxes on Southerners. However, this really sort of divided Andrew Jackson and his vice president, John C. Calhoun. We're going to see that Calhoun became a Whig, mostly because the Whigs were the "we don't like Andrew Jackson" party, not because he agreed with them in any way. We'll actually see that he becomes a Democrat again after Jackson leaves office. Now, another big issue is the removal of Native Americans from the eastern portion of the United States. So the Jackson administration saw an increase in the removal of Native Americans, starting with Missouri and Illinois, who moved their Native Americans out early and first. And then in 1830, Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, which was going to expel the 5 quote-unquote civilized tribes of the American Southeast, who lived in places like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, basically forcing them to move off their lands and into what was called Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. These 5 tribes, led by the Cherokee Nation, had tried to sort of adapt and assimilate into the American way of living. They spoke English, they practiced Christianity, they owned enslaved people, which was a sign of, ironically, of civilization at the time. However, Jackson still viewed them as savages and said they were therefore not worthy of owning their own land. So here are the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Now, the tribes actually, since they were Americans, since they were trying to do things the reasonable way, they went to Congress and they went to the Supreme Court saying that they had the right to own land, both as Americans and separately as members of their own slightly more independent nation. Now, although the Supreme Court had in the past ruled against Native Americans, in this case, the Supreme Court case of Worcester versus Georgia actually said that Native people were a distinct nation and also that the federal government could remove them or not, but the states could not. They were trying to be removed by the state of Georgia. However, Jackson backed the states in this situation and refused to recognize that the court had any power. He basically said the Supreme Court is only as good as people allow it to be, and I don't believe in what the Supreme Court just passed. So he straight up legitimately ignored the Supreme Court decision, and that is really important. Goes all the way back to the idea of judicial review, and the idea that a president can overlook the power of the Supreme Court is very important. As Andrew Jackson allegedly put it, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Now, the Cherokee refused to move. However, eventually the army was sent in, and this is under President Van Buren, and forces them off their land. And they moved from 1838 to 39 from Georgia into Oklahoma, and it was at least 18,000 Native American men, women, and children moving, and about 1/4 of them died along the way, which is how this gets its name, the Trail of Tears. Most other tribes in the American Southeast moved peaceably after this, although the Seminoles in Florida did resist, leading to 2 different Seminole Wars. So here we see the groups that were being moved during this time, where they were being moved from and where they were being moved to as well. And so here we can see what is called the Trail of Tears. And here's the Trail of Tears painting painted in 1942. Now, let's look at the Bank War. This is the last big thing that Jackson did. So, of all the conflicts, this one seemed the most personal, this Bank War. Jackson was not a fan of bankers in general. He thought they didn't really produce anything. They just, as in the words of Thomas Jefferson, just wanted to move your money around. He thought of them as greedy, manipulative, corrupt. He distrusted paper money in general. He only believed in what's called specie, which is hard currency, gold and silver in your hand. He especially did not like the Bank of the United States, as he thought it was both corrupt and, according to Jefferson, unconstitutional. Now, the head of the Bank of the United States, a guy named Nicholas Biddle, was pretty, I don't know if he was corrupt, but he was definitely arrogant. And he boasted that he had the power to destroy any state bank, and Andrew Jackson didn't like that. Biddle said he got Congress to reauthorize the bank in 1832. He actually did it early, hoping that if Jackson refused, it would hurt his reelection campaign. And so he did this hoping that, I don't know, maybe he thought that Jackson would veto it and that would help him, but in the end, Jackson vetoed it, and he explained it to the American people why he vetoed it, and the American people sided with Jackson over the bank. So Nicholas Biddle drastically overestimated how popular he and the Bank of the United States were. So Andrew Jackson once said, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Now, Whigs in Congress said that Jackson was exceeding his power and using the veto not as it was designed to be, which was almost as like a blunt instrument to beat Congress with. But Jackson believed that he had the power to do so. And the people, regular people, were on Jackson's side. And we see this in the election of 1832. Nicholas Biddle had hoped that if Jackson vetoed the Bank of the United States, it would kill his reelection campaign. In the end, however, Jackson won in a landslide. And so Jackson destroyed the Bank of the United States. Here is a sign that the Whigs did not like Jackson very much. They called him King Andrew I. This cartoon was drawn around 1832, portraying Jackson as a tyrant and a king. And he is standing on top of the Constitution, a bill for internal improvements, and a bill for the Bank of the United States, showing the things that he has sort of gotten rid of during this time, according to the Whigs. So, again, he destroyed the National Bank. However, later on, he got his face put on a $20 bill. I love that kind of irony. Now, the death of the Bank of the United States meant that the smaller state banks were no longer being regulated by the bigger national bank. And this meant that they kind of had a field day. They printed off a whole bunch of paper currency called soft money, and they used it to do things like speculate in real estate. Now, there were also promoters of specie, hard money, who hated all banks and believed that only tangible gold and silver was the way to go. So the pet banks, the small banks, loved Jackson for this. The people who liked specie loved Jackson for this. And Jackson basically killed the Bank of the United States by removing all the federal money from it and placing it into these smaller state banks, many of which had personal or political connections to Jackson or his friends, and these were known as Jackson's pet banks. Problem is that the national bank, the Bank of the United States, was doing a job on making sure that things didn't get too out of hand in the smaller state banks. So we see the pet banks after this just started printing off, churning out paper money, and speculating in Western land. And they were getting richer and richer. However, eventually this sort of real estate bubble of the 19th century burst during the Van Buren administration. And we see that other countries stopped accepting American paper money as having any value. They demanded gold or silver, which many people did not have. And this began the Panic of 1837, which saw many businesses fail around the country, saw the price of goods fall by as much as 25%. So suddenly, in the period after Jackson, Van Buren was having a lot of problems related to what Andrew Jackson had done. So, this is, by the way, Martin Van Buren, his friend and chosen successor. He beat 3 Whigs for the White House in 1836, and it was, again, Congress who had to decide, just like with Jefferson or Burr. Van Buren had not been a fan of the banks as well. However, he wanted to increase stability, so he took all the federal money out of the pet banks and put it into the American Treasury. We're not going to have a Federal Reserve for a long time after this, where nowadays that's where we put our money. Democrats who did not like the pet bank did not like the loss of federal money. However, the Democrats who did like this applauded Van Buren, and they moved back to his side, including John C. Calhoun. So here's our 8th president, Martin Van Buren, 1837 to 41, from a place called Old Kinderhook, New York, which is actually where we get the term okay from. People who worked for Van Buren said that he was Old Kinderhook, and therefore he was okay. He was a senator of New York, governor of New York, secretary of state, minister to Great Britain, and vice president under Andrew Jackson's 2nd term in office. He also originally spoke Dutch. He spoke English as a second language. Now, this economic depression and the fact that Van Buren was no Andrew Jackson led to a much closer race in 1840. And the Whigs sort of picked up on the game that the Democrats were playing, and so they chose William Henry Harrison as their candidate and tried to make him into sort of another Andrew Jackson. Harrison was born into the wealthy Harrison family of Virginia. There were several Harrisons who signed, or at least one Harrison who signed the Declaration of Independence. But he was a war hero. That made him very Jacksonian. Other than that, they basically said, no, he's not a rich, wealthy guy. He goes and he lives in a cabin in the woods and drinks hard cider instead of drinking champagne in a big villa. He got a nickname. He got the name of Tippecanoe. That was the battle that he won. He got a song called Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And so they basically used a lot of the same sort of ideas that the Democrats did to get this quote-unquote common man elected into the White House. So here's a pro-Harrison political cartoon. Harrison's running mate, by the way, was John Tyler, who was an ex-Democrat who had become a Whig during nullification. He did not believe in any Whig principles. He was a Democrat through and through, but he had ditched the Democratic Party. And so he had very few friends on either side, actually. But the Whigs hoped that he would get more Southern Democrats to sort of move over to their side. And this use of political propaganda and appealing to the undecideds worked, and Harrison won in a big victory in 1841. And so here's our 9th president, William Henry Harrison, president from 1841 to 1841. He's from Virginia, but he lived out in the West, where he was a general in the War of 1812, congressman of the Northwest Territory, governor of Indiana, and congressman and senator from Ohio. As you can see by the dates, too, he's also our first president to ever die in office. In fact, he only made it 1 month. So, Like we said, he died pretty quickly. William Henry Harrison died due to pneumonia, which some people think was brought on by the fact that he gave a very long speech in the freezing rain, and he wanted to prove how manly and strong he was, and so he didn't wear a coat or a hat, and it ended up killing him. Now, Whigs in Congress thought that having a Whig in power, or at least a non-Democrat like John Tyler, would help out their cause, and so they tried to pass the American system laws, internal improvements, and things like that. However, Tyler still held on to his democratic small government values and vetoed these. This meant that he had a very long 4 years where nobody really liked him. He was abandoned by both the Democrats and the Whigs. He did, however, prove one important idea, which is that people weren't sure what the power of a president would be if they were taking over after the death of another president. Do they have the full powers of the president? And Tyler said, yes, I absolutely do. I have all the powers of a president. I'm not just a stand-in president. Although, as you can tell by his nickname, he got the nickname His Accidency. People saying, perhaps, maybe we don't like this guy very much. So here's our 10th president, John Tyler, 1841 to 45, from Virginia. He was a congressman, governor of Virginia, senator from Virginia, and vice president until William Henry Harrison died. He also became a Confederate congressman during the Civil War and then died during the Civil War as well. So he had a very long and interesting life. And we'll see more about him and other presidents later on.